Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I'm Susan Bryson. I teach in the philosophy department, and it is a real honor for me and one that gives me great pleasure to be able to introduce you to this year's Stephen R. Volk, class of 57 lecturer, Professor Mari Matsuda, who is professor of law at the Georgetown University Law Center. Prior to joining the faculty at Georgetown, Professor Matsuda was a professor of law at the University of California at Los Angeles School of Law, and prior to that, she taught at the University of Hawaii School of Law. The first tenured female Asian American law professor in the United States, Professor Matsuda is an activist scholar who has not only authored several critically acclaimed books and numerous law review articles that are among those most frequently cited, but has also published widely in academic and popular journals such as Amerasia Journal and Ms. Magazine. One of the primary voices in critical race theory since its inception, Professor Matsuda is internationally recognized expert on civil rights, feminist theory, affirmative action, and hate speech. Her books include Called from Within, Words That Wound, Where Is Your Body, and We Won't Go Back, Making a Case for Affirmative Action, which she co-authored with Charles Lawrence. Today's Volk Lecture is part of Dartmouth's two-week celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and is also part of this year's Dartmouth Center's Forum series on the topic Class Divide. I'd like to thank the people who made this event possible, the Dartmouth Lawyers Association, and the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences, especially Associate Director Sadhana Hall, and most especially the Coordinator of Public and Special Events, Judy Fothergill, who just reminded me to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. I'd also like to thank the co-sponsors of this talk, the Legal Studies faculty, especially this year's faculty convener, Professor Jim Murphy. The Office of Institutional Diversity and Equity, especially Holly Satea, the interim vice president, the Office of Pluralism and Leadership, in particular Nora Yasamura, the advisor to Asian and Asian American students, the Tucker Foundation, the Office of Student Life, and the East Wheelock Cluster. I'm not entirely sure when I first learned of Professor Matsuda's groundbreaking work, but it might have been in the course of reading Judge Avern Cohn's 1989 U.S. District Court opinion in the case that ruled unconstitutional the policy on discrimination and discriminatory harassment that had been adopted by the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Now, I thought this policy was an entirely appropriate and much needed response to a series of horrendously racist incidents on that campus. And I was genuinely baffled by Judge Cohn's opinion, which begins with the words, quote, "It is an unfortunate fact of our constitutional system that the ideals of freedom and equality are often in conflict." And it concludes that, quote, "While the court is sympathetic to the university's obligation to ensure equal educational opportunities for all its students, such efforts must not be at the expense of free speech." I thought, okay, where's the argument for that conclusion? And I couldn't find one, not in that opinion, nor in other judicial opinions in similar cases. But there was one note of hope at the end of Judge Cohn's opinion in the form of an addendum. In this, Judge Cohn wrote, quote, "Inexplicably, the court did not become aware of a conference on legal storytelling at the university's law school, that is University of Michigan's law school, in April 1989 until after its opinion was docked. Important for consideration of a broader perspective of the issues put by the policy and the court's holding of unconstitutionality under the First Amendment is a paper delivered at the conference by Mari J. Matsuda, Public Response to Racist Speech, Considering the Victim's Story, which was then published in the Michigan Law Review. Professor Matsuda's description of her purpose amply describes the significance of the paper. This is a quote from her article. "This article attempts to begin a conversation about the First Amendment that acknowledges both the civil libertarian's fear of tyranny and the victim's experience of loss of liberty in a society that tolerates racist speech. It suggests criminalization of a narrow, explicitly defined class of racist hate speech to provide public redress for the most serious harm, while leaving many forms of racist speech to private remedies. This is not an easy legal or moral puzzle. But it is precisely in these places where we feel conflicting tugs at heart and mind that we have the most work to do and the most knowledge to gain. Another area in which we currently have the most work to do and the most knowledge to gain is that of the inequities in our country's public education system. Professor Matsuda is currently at work on a book on this subject with Charles Lawrence, and her Voc lecture this afternoon is entitled Emancipation from Mental Slavery, Public Education and Social Change. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mari Matsuda.
Thank you, Dr. Bryson. Thank you, Dartmouth, for being here today. I know, particularly for those of you who are students, there are so many other places you could be right now, and I really appreciate that you came to hear me speak today. This was billed as a talk on public education, and I'm perfectly prepared to speak about public education, which is what I've been talking about endlessly, it seems, for the past 4 years. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about public education in the question and answer. And I am going to touch on public education, but there's a bigger question pushing me, and that's the social change part of my talk. So most of what I say today is going to move in that direction. But I hope to make this a conversation so we can take this wherever this audience chooses to go. The snow is falling on the ground, and beautiful is the face of my beloved. That is a line of Kenneth Patchen poetry that came to me when I looked out on your green this morning. And it's from a love poem, but also an anti-war poem. The poet intended to contrast that intimate experience of being next to someone you love with what's going on in the wider world, where war rages and bodies are ripped apart like rags. While quiet snow falls, quiet violence happens everywhere. In Washington, D.C., where I live, a couple of weeks ago, a mentally ill mother was found in her home with the bodies of her 4 dead children, bodies that had been sitting there, the police think, for about 6 months. In the nearby suburbs, a child died because he had a toothache, a cavity, that went untreated until it became a brain abscess. In both of these cases, a caring person anticipated disaster. A school social worker called the police. You've got to get into that house. I haven't seen these children in school. Something's wrong. And she called several times, and we have recordings of those phone calls. A legal aid lawyer tried to help the mother of the child with the cavity. She went from dentist to dentist. Will you take Medicaid? No. So these community caretakers are left to mourn. The press follows up with a series of articles, should have, could have, if only. Our mayor last week fired a handful of child protection service workers and police dispatchers, people who were in that chain of command where they possibly could have done something and didn't. And we see the expose story. There was another one recently in the Post when a general was fired at Walter Reed Hospital, when the Post found out that our returned veterans who are recovering from brain damage and missing body parts are living amid squalor and rodent feces and leaking ceilings in inadequate housing around Walter Reed. Shameful things And we are supposed to say, this is outrageous, this is terrible. This is not supposed to happen. The way this is framed is isolated incident, terrible bureaucracy, incompetent people. If someone had done their job, this wouldn't have happened. But we have never, in the history of this country, taken care of our veterans with the intent of fully meeting their needs, because we focus primarily on how to make wars, not how to pick up the broken pieces that wars leave behind. Poverty, and in particular, child poverty, has always been with us and is growing in this country, and we have never been willing to eradicate the root causes of child poverty. It is a package called injustice, and ending any one piece of it requires taking on the whole of it. Each thing that you see that kindles outrage is important because seeing is the first part. Injustice persists when information about its existence is suppressed. If you have talked to a nurse who works in a VA hospital, if you've talked to a volunteer at an urban homeless shelter, they can tell you about the mentally ill vets who come in and who don't get the care that they need. They can tell you that we have not done what we need to do to serve the needs of those who fight war in our name. If you talk to a teacher who teaches at what we call a high poverty school, and there's one in your state and every state in this country, they will tell you they've seen children with cavities and aching teeth who have never seen a dentist, not once in their life. They will tell you about children who have parents who are in desperate need of intervention for mental illness or drug or alcohol addiction. I don't know much about New Hampshire, but I can tell you that a child in this state went to school hungry this morning, leaving behind a parent sleeping in a haze of untreated drug or alcohol addiction. I know this happens because I know my country. I know we have no adequate systems in place to intervene when families are living in that haze. It's not that we don't know how to do it. We have chosen not to. I have studied public education closely for 4 years. The models exist for fixing schools, for providing wraparound social services so that no child will fall through the cracks when they're not getting adequate parenting. We know what early childhood education of quality will do, that it will make a permanent change in the lives of poor children, and that we will get positive educational outcomes from it. We know how to do this. We choose not to. So if you go out and you are in the world rather than above it, you will see these so-called incidences of tragedy piling up to become a structure. The Post will frame the story about Walter Reed as an expose, a singular event, not an ordinary event. And this kind of frame endorses militarism. The Army works. When things don't work, we get rid of the bad general. It was shocking that that one time it didn't work. On the theory side, as a critical race theorist, the work I do is ideological. When someone says, it wasn't supposed to happen this way, the critical race theorist asks, well, how was it supposed to happen? What would the world look like if we really meant for it not to happen this way. We call for a structural, historical, cultural analysis, meaning history has created a structure that produces a culture that justifies predictably unjust results. The way it is working, or not working, is how it will work until we understand that what we're up against is a structure and that that structure requires deliberate dismantling. Now, that's very abstract. And in our book on public education, we try to get specific. So we talk about what's not working in public education, how it got there, what we need to do to change it. And we're trying to paint not just an expose kind of a picture, but a more complex picture. Because it's easy to do the outrage piece on the schools in my city, where there are filthy toilets and freezing classrooms and rodent feces in the cafeteria. What's harder is to describe how learning does take place in these halls, how gifted teachers can create buzzing hives of learning in rooms where paint is peeling off the walls. And where not so gifted teachers keep trying because they do genuinely care about children. You see a teacher who yells too much, who gives out the same recopied worksheets year after year, but who will slip $20 to a kid on Friday because she knows that kid's not going home to a decent dinner and won't have another free meal from the school until Monday morning. You see scrappy principals who figure out ways to get around rules, and stubborn parents who shadow the contractors who they know will try to cheat the school system because there's no oversight capacity when they come in to make changes. I was at a PTA meeting about 2 months ago where I was so tired I actually started crying when they talked about what had happened to our windows. We've been trying to get windows in my neighborhood school ever since I became a parent there, which was 7 years ago. I now have a kid in 8th grade who started in pre-K, so what, 8 years ago, 9 years ago. The windows don't work. Some of them won't close, and that means when it's below freezing, the wind is whipping in with the freezing air, and the kids have to leave the classroom and go to the cafeteria. Some of them won't open, which means the kids bake in the summer, or in the winter because the boiler doesn't work. Some rooms get overheated, and you can't open the window to let in the cold, so the teacher in the dead of winter in a school system that doesn't have enough money to pay for heating fuel will turn on the air conditioner so that the kids can not bake in the classroom. All right, so for 8 years we've been trying to get windows. Finally, this summer we have a new mayor and there was a new publicity blitz and some new money and we were going to get windows. So the contractor put in windows. But the contractor, it's an old school, so that's huge cathedral windows that are curved at the top, so it was a custom job to get the new ones put in. Made these custom windows. If you have trouble hearing me, just go like this. And, all right. And the sound people will work to make sure you can hear. All right. So I'm just going to finish this window story. There was a 1-inch gap all the way around the window because they didn't make a window that would fit. So the cold air is still whipping in. So the proposal the contractor had was to fill it in with untreated construction grade lumber. Well, first of all, that's not legal. And it won't work, and it's ugly. But we were told, well, if we have to sue to enforce the contract, it'll be another 3 years, or we can go with this stopgap measure. And that's when I started to weep, just quietly in the back of the room, and that's just because of sleep deprivation and things like that. But the point of the story is that this doesn't happen at places like Dartmouth. If they order new windows here, they will get the right size. And if the right size doesn't come, they'll say, we're Dartmouth, you can't give us the wrong size, take them back, we won't take them. But it happens in urban school districts because the system is broken. And for so long, nothing has worked, that there's nobody around who knows how to make things work. And that's a lay person's version of something that people who do systems engineering can give you very fancy language for. But the reality is of broken infrastructure, both in terms of the resources that it takes to do things right and the managerial structure it takes to do things right. You need professional contract compliance people to make sure that these things are done right. And you've got that here at Dartmouth. And we don't have that in urban public school districts. We don't have so many of what we need. We don't have school social workers. We don't have school nurses. If your kid gets sick on the 4 days out of 5 when there is no school nurse, they just sit in the library until a parent can get off from work to get the kid. There's nobody to take care of the kid. And as you know, many working parents can't just take off. All right. So I can go on and on about systems failure and what it would take to change it. And we know what it would take to change it. It would take, among other things, resources. But we're back to a little story that I want to tell you. This is actually a metaphor. It's one that a student brought to class that she learned from her Jesuit social justice teachers. In this story, you're standing in a stream, and babies are floating down the river, and it's an emergency, and you start pulling them out of the river. Oh my gosh. And you're calling other people, help, help, take this baby. And they keep coming. And you're trying to figure out, how are these babies falling in the river? Somebody's got to figure it out, but you can't get out of the river and go figure out what's happening because the babies are coming, so you're throwing. All right. And this is a metaphor for how hard it is to be a justice worker because everything's an emergency. You don't have time to think about broad structural causes. And schoolwork feels like this. So parents bring in paper when the teacher runs out of paper, and they find a coat for a kid who comes to school without a coat, and they come in and paint the cafeteria rather than waiting for a requisition that's going to take 5 years. But we don't know how to confront a nation that can suddenly find billions to spend on war, but can't get a ream of paper to a classroom. There are at least 3 things wrong with the baby in the river metaphor. The first problem is how we cast this story. The rescuer is able-bodied, active, caring, has agency. The victims are babies, innocent, passive, unable to help themselves. In real, actual life, we are all both in the river and on the banks. The relentless current called injustice has the potential to sweep us all away. But we have agency to stop it. And learned passivity has made us believe that we can't. Another problem with the story is that it sets up a divide between cause and effect. Well, should we go to the source and find out what's making babies fall in the river? Or should we deal with the work right in front of us? In fact, we can do both. And in fact, doing both is the only way to do either. The PTA mom who's fighting for windows is learning about causes. Doing the work is the best way to understand how these things happen. Talk to the contractor, the principal, the person downtown who's supposed to be issuing the purchase order, and you learn about how broken systems operate and what needs to change. You develop a critique that gives you the best chance of getting to where the real power to make change resides. Finally, I don't like the baby story because its tone is desperate individualism. It's all up to me, the beleaguered justice worker. No time, no way out, no solution to the endless emergencies facing my community. No time to get to the big questions of cause. But justice work is not for cynics, not for pessimists, and not for heroes. The parents who organize cleanup days, coat drives, candy sales, know something about the key to change. They know how to do it together in groups, acting on something they care about, and that is how change starts. All that is missing is to take that one step uphill to the Hall of the Mountain King, where the ice is melting and forming a raging river that sweeps up babies. Will Durant once called all of human history a river of blood. He spoke of wars and apocalypse made by powerful men while the majority of the human race toils on the side of the riverbanks, trying to tend crops and raise families without getting caught up by the river. From time to time, he said, the river overflows its banks and the innocent are caught up in the torrent. I could say September 11th or Katrina, or name a place like Darfur or Dresden, and you could add your own to the list. The people on the outside of power, the families who have to send their children to inadequate schools, the workers who are not getting full value for their labor, the refugees running from the carnage left by militarism, always outnumber those who are advantaged by war, injustice, and equality. We call it oppression because it's the few over the many. And that's why it can't last. It is internally and definitionally unstable, like an inverted pyramid. Try to hold that up in your hand and understand why they think they have to have guns. Change will come when large numbers of those disadvantaged by the present system get together and demand it. So I'm going to leave out the whole middle of this paper, which talks about how schools have gotten so bad, the ideological system that justifies it, and why that ideological system is false. Because I want to go straight to the end, which is the part that always gets cut off. And that's the how do you change it part. The many students over the years who have said to me, so what are we going to do about it? Are the inspiration for a new class that I'm teaching called Organizing for Social Change. In this class, each student is asked to go out and change something. My students, it turns out, are not ideological victims. They have not been hoodwinked. They know that something is desperately wrong with this world and that change is required. What has them sitting still is a learned habit of inaction and a disbelief that they could actually make the changes necessary to get from a world in which failing schools and poverty and war are seen as inevitable to a world of mutual care. What I owe those students and you is more than an exhortation to go out and do justice. How do we emancipate ourselves from mental slavery? How do we act with agency as our Constitution requires to govern ourselves in ways that will make snow-covered tranquility more than an illusion? Somewhere in this community and every community in this country, there is someone who knows how to do it. That person is called an organizer. Now, you can bring the organizer to your classroom, and I've done that. I've found actual organizers and gotten them to team teach with me. But you can also bring that person to the classroom through books and film. There are people who have worked hard to capture this story and make it available. And when you listen to the organizers, there are some repeated lessons that become obvious. First, you have to believe in the intelligence and the capacity of ordinary people and their ability to make change. Now, everything is set up to make us believe the opposite. Most students at a place like Dartmouth came from high schools that were considered exclusive, the best. And regardless of what kind of school you came from, you were considered at the top of that pile. So the impression is created that some funnel exists through which only the most talented emerge, and they're here. Corollary, if the best and the brightest are here, then the rest and the lightest are there. But it may be true, as Thomas Jefferson believed, that intellect is randomly distributed throughout the gene pool. And there are some people with tremendous intelligence who do not have available to them educational advantage. What if it takes tremendous intelligence, skill, perseverance to survive as a single mom raising kids in a frozen trailer park? As a coal miner laying dynamite in a tunnel that's 3 feet high? Or as an immigrant transnavigating borders and cultures and languages? We don't have a metric for measuring that form of intelligence, but we do have a record. It's called human survival. We are here because of a deep well of intelligence, skill, and fortitude that resides in the places where ordinary people live. I'd like you to think about your own genealogies. Maybe you can name a person who would not be considered smart by Dartmouth standards, but whose intellect and strength and talent allowed your family to survive and brought you here. Believing in the strength and talent of ordinary people is a prerequisite to organizing for social change, so honor that ancestor and remember her power. Step 2, start from the needs and self-interests of ordinary people. Listen and learn about the conditions of their lives. Good organizers don't walk into the room with their own to-do list, even when it's absolutely clear what a community needs. They need decent schools, affordable health care, housing. Listen. In each workplace, each neighborhood, the list is slightly different. I had students this semester in organizing that wanted to work on the issue of big box retailers, the anti-Walmart movement. But they found out that in DC, we have an urban environment in which it's so depleted that there are huge swaths of the city where there are no stores at all. People were really excited about the chance to have a Target, a place to buy pencil and paper without having to go all the way out to the suburbs, a job in a clean, well-lit space. So instead of a Stop the Big Box campaign, they joined a living wage campaign that was designed to get a local ordinance that would require retailers that were over so many square feet to have somewhat improved wage an hour and working conditions. When we talk about self-interest, when I push that, I say, well, you've got to start with people's self-interest. The students push back because self-interest sounds too close to selfish to them. How do we get from there to the place that Dr. King called beloved community? Well, one way to argue with my students is to charge them with elitism. Altruism is a luxury of elite university students. Working people can't afford that. But as we studied and reflected on the experience of organizers, our understanding of self-interest expanded. We watched a film from last year's Houston Janitors Action, and we saw a woman who was dying of breast cancer, working on that campaign, she said, because no worker should have to go without health care when they're faced with a life-threatening illness. And she doesn't want anyone else to go through what she's been through. We studied this strike and saw how ordinary people risked everything, their jobs, their physical safety, as police on horseback came charging into their picket lines. We heard again and again from them that they were doing it for dignity, for respect, for their children, for the next generation, for ideals that transcended the short-term goals of the strike, which were wages and benefits. The exhortation to focus on self-interest means to take people's needs seriously and to meet them where they are. The all-consuming concern of parents is a decent education for their children. So organize around schools. It's a natural way to harness actual need and convert it into actual power. And it doesn't mean that people are always selfish. The third rule I presented to my students was picking an attainable goal. This is called strategy. You build power and sustain power by picking a target that you can actually reach. In order to do that, you have to sit down and evaluate what your resources are, and of these 5 different goals, which is the goal that's most likely to meet your long-term and short-term goals. So you might have goals like world peace, community building, but you've got to have a specific, so you'll know whether you got it or not, and you're not just flailing around in the abstract. My students said to me, we would like to end global warming. Good, I said. You're not going to do that before graduation. Pick an attainable goal. So they came back with a list. We would like 2-sided copying in the library. We would like the coffee bar to give a discount to people who use a mug. Do you think they can get that by graduation? Yes. Oh my God, if they can't get that, should we even give them their degrees? All right. I think they're going to get it, and I'm proud of them that they're trying. But when they came into my office with that list, 2-sided paper copying, I said, what's that going to do about coal? My student gave me a blank look. And then I went on a little screed about my friends who are so diligent about their recycling but insist that they need to keep their SUV, because how else are they going to drive the recycling to the recycling station? I talked about the lobbyists who are not going to let us get anything through Congress that will do anything real about fossil fuel dependency. And don't even get me started on the war, I said. two-sided paper copying? So I push my students because I don't know the answers to these questions either, and we learn. So this particular student, who is a bicycle riding, surfer, laid-back California kind of guy with very big eyes, he says, "Professor Matsuda, we have to start somewhere." I said nothing. This technique is called the silent probe. So he took a deep breath and he started again. If students get used to two-sided copying and they understand why it's important, then when they go to their law firms, they'll ask their firms to start doing it. And then maybe they'll start thinking about coal. Well, he did not convince me that the individual choice model, by the way, he doesn't want us to be drinking water out of plastic bottles either. He has not convinced me that that individual choice model is going to get us where we need to go. But he changed me. I used to stop at the faculty lounge every day on the way to class to get a cup of tea, a paper cup. I will never do that again. I will never go to class with a paper cup. I use a mug. Another student said disdainfully, "Those people that use 3, 4, 5 paper towels, they're so selfish." Another student said, "I see people washing their hair at the beach, and the shampoo's just going in the sand. They don't know what it's doing to the reef." This was when I was teaching in Hawaii. Well, to both of these students, I had to confess that I was that person. I was taking more than one paper towel. I was washing my hair at the beach when I had someplace else I had to go and didn't have time to go home for a shower. And I stopped. The culture of our collective practices changes because we're social. And my students, because I like them, shamed me and changed my culture. So they're working at me on the individual action end. I'm pushing at them on the structural change end, because I don't think we're going to get all the way to where we need to go by each one of us stopping this. But it does matter. And I will never forget the student who said to me, "We have to start somewhere." So, attainable goals. Connected to that rule that we have to have attainable goals is a rule that you have to have a specific target. There has to be a real, live person with the power to make that change happen. In the case of two-sided paper copying and mugs in the coffee bar, the target was my dean. As it often is at the university, because ultimately that's where the power to make change resides. So my students targeted the dean. And I happen to know, although I didn't tell them, that he's going to be sympathetic to their demands. And this is the thing, until you push, how do you know what change you can get? Sometimes it's going to be easy. Then you know you should have pushed harder and asked for more. Donna Shalala, a woman who I have admired in other contexts, was the president at the University of Miami when she had the unfortunate experience of being the target. The target, I say to my students, always has a name and a face. So Shalala became the target because there was a living wage campaign for decent hourly wages and benefits for the workers at the university. And she said, the university can't afford it. So the union launched a publicity campaign, and they got the New York Times to do stories about President Shalala's palatial mansion, her yacht, the different beds in the mansion for her dogs, the crew of staff to keep the dog and the yacht and the garden all running beautifully and everything luxurious and wonderful. And there was a very long struggle. And it was a serious struggle, and some workers even ended up in the hospital as a result of a hunger strike. And in the end, the target, President Shalala, found the money that the university previously didn't have to give the workers their raises and their benefits. The kind of change that organizers are looking for is change that alters the relationships of power. The actions we studied, where the lowest paid workers were banding together, you saw people who are not supposed to have power, immigrants, service workers, janitors, limited English speakers, gain power through their collective action. And the people we think of as powerful, former cabinet member Donna Shalala, the mayor of the city of Houston, the police chief, they became powerless in the face of organized labor power. You can arrest a dozen workers and shut down a small campaign. But if you have 1,000 workers willing to fill the streets and another 1,000 willing to take their place if you arrest them all, you don't have the capacity as the police chief to arrest all those people. You don't have enough room in your prison. When it became clear that this was what was going to happen in Houston until the workers got a contract, the mayor went on television together with the leaders of the strike and announced happily that the strike was settled, there was going to be a contract, and this was going to be a good thing for the city. The workers found out how powerful they were, and they had a new friend in the mayor. And if they can sustain that sense of power, they can ask their new friend to do something to fix their schools and the crumbling infrastructure in the neighborhoods where they live. So the goal of this organizing ultimately is altering existing conditions of power and giving ordinary citizens that knowledge that they, in fact, can run their own cities and make things happen for them. The way to sustain this is to have institutions. And that means buildings, phones, officers, boards of directors. It means things like unions and membership organizations and community centers. Now, when I start talking like this, I start losing people in the audience. I know this happens with my students. Union, that means bloated, old school, good old boy, bureaucratic, slow-moving, entrenched, dinosaur-like entities. Anything that's an actual institution feels to them like the opposite of the kind of anarchic, spontaneous, non-hierarchical, organic, free-floating, utopian people power that they think of as bringing about true social change. Okay, institutions risk all the negatives of institutions, but they are also a means of consolidating power and creating a platform from which you go to the next level. And successful movements require infrastructure. Of course, we want this infrastructure to be democratic, flexible, decentralized, democratic in meaning responsive to what actual people need, but we still need the structure. If we want to bring 1 million people to Washington, D.C. to lobby Congress to end global poverty, we're going to have portable toilets. We're going to have a medical tent, legal observers with video cameras to make sure that there's no police brutality. All of this will require organizational capacity. So I'm not opposed to building the organizations that can provide that capacity, and in fact, I argue that it's essential. Anytime I get didactic and say to my students, these are the rules, and they actually look at books like Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals and the Midwest Academy's Book of Strategy for Social Change, I get pushback from students, particularly law students, because all we do in law school is teach people how to deconstruct rules, and that's an important rhetorical skill. rules are useful if we understand that in interpreting and making these rules work for us, we have to have a compass. And that's the last thing I want to talk about. The compass is the utopian vision. We have to know that a better world is possible and to have a specific picture of what it's going to look like. So in the beginning of the semester, I ask each student to go up to the board and write one thing that they would like to see in the world to come, that better world that we don't have now. And some of the things they write down are big and obvious. No one should have to die of a preventable disease, one of my students wrote. And I know this is a student who lost her father to illness. Everyone should have adequate housing. Every child should have access to literacy. The obvious things. And then sometimes they write little idiosyncratic things. A student once wrote, we should give a house in the neighborhood to every teacher within walking distance of the school they teach at, so that the students could see the teachers living and working in the community. A couple semesters ago, a student put down that we should treat all sentient beings as our equals. And I couldn't resist asking him, David, what about mollusks? And he said he's not sure how sentient mollusks were, but he would not write them off. One year I went up to the board and wrote that I wanted a tool library. And when they asked me what that meant, I said, well, a place where you could get a table saw or a serger so you wouldn't have to go out and buy one for yourself if you were only going to use it every 6 months. And they said to me, what's a serger? And that led to a discussion about how nobody knows how to do anything anymore. We've been so disempowered from the means of production that none of us actually knows how anything is produced. Look on the inside of your sleeve, I said. That surged. Yeah. Most of you are wearing sweatshirts, so you'll see what surging is. It's different from sewing. Once we start going off like that, they can start adding to the list. Yeah, you should be able to go to the tool library and get a serger, and the tool library should also have a this and a that, and we should be able to do this, and we should be able to do that. And students see how easy it is, once you loosen up a little bit, to envision this space that's going to be so much better for human beings. A world that we would really want to leave to our grandchildren and that we'd be so proud to have participated in creating. The snow is falling on the ground, and we are in danger of leaving a planet without breathable air to our beloveds. Our failure to see kinship with the mentally ill mother, the war refugee, with these fellow human beings, much less with mollusks, has gotten us to a terrible, isolated place of stillness in the face of events that could bring about our collective demise. Nuclear weapons proliferate as our abilities of diplomacy atrophy. My students fight for two-sided copying while we tear down mountains in a bone-crushing orgy over coal that will burn a hole in the sky, that blue sky over our heads that has sheltered us from the sun, that star so much bigger than us that cares not whether we thrive or shrivel. We have to start somewhere. And there is a long, proud history of ordinary people standing up to the takers and grabbers who would destroy the calm of our snow-covered ground. That history is available to you. You should study it and try it yourselves. Start in school. A safe place to experiment with making change while you still have the training wheels on your bicycle. It's an election year, a wonderful time to have your youth, to make history, to make a difference. Pick an attainable goal, a target with a name, and make something happen in your pond. And I promise you that you will be part of something bigger than yourself, and it will give meaning and power and purpose to your life. The river of history flows, and we are helpless drifters if we act alone. The river of history flows, and its course changes forever when we act upon it with collectivity and vision. A revolution was fought on this snow-covered ground and made the United States of America, with a core of ideas about liberty and equality. As you know, those ideas have marked us as hypocrites for much of our history, but we don't have to abandon them, as Dr. King did not abandon them. We can claim them as real possibility. Beautiful is the face of my beloved community. May we act so that she may thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. We have half an hour for discussion, and I will try to keep a speakers list. There are a couple of people with microphones walking around the room, so just raise your hand if you would like to ask a question.
Dr. Matsuda, you talked about it being election year. Has a single one of the presidential candidates said anything significant or hopeful, as far as you're concerned, about bringing about necessary change? If so, what is it?
I have liked John Edwards. First of all, I would like students to be idealistic and political at the same time, wise about politicians. We don't have to love them, and none of them are going to be perfect, and they're all politicians. So I'm not in love with any of the current candidates. I see many of my students really swept up with Obama, and they are influencing me because I think the kind of energy and enthusiasm that he's created among young people is what we need to avoid the kind of anti-democratic cynicism that I think is killing our country. So for those of you who are Obama supporters, I salute you. The reason I said Edwards first is that I feel that he has had, he and Dennis Kucinich have had the most populist message that is relentless in talking about poverty. There is just no excuse for us to tolerate the level of poverty that we do in the richest country in the world. And worker poverty, that is people who get up every morning and go to work, sometimes to more than one job, can't afford to pay their heating bill. That's outrageous. And I would like to hear more politicians just say that straight out, say we can end it, and we will. But all of them are singing that populist tune to some extent. And I see a pendulum swinging back toward real human needs. And I think it's going to be up to young people in particular to keep it pushed that way. I would like to urge students to ask questions. I was one of the ones that would just sit there with all my questions too scared to ask. So if you're that person, take a chance.
Hi, Dr. Matsuda. You talked about having a specific vision for a utopian future. And you also talked about two specific channels for change. One is environmental change, and the other was a living wage. At some point, I've been influenced by the idea that there might be a conflict between these two channels of change. At some point, when you try to improve the environmental situation, you might be reducing jobs and reducing the possibility of people having a living wage. How do you deal with these possible conflicts and the infinite channels of change that you take towards a utopian future?
Yeah. We are faced often with what I call job blackmail. So we need to stop using coal. But there are a lot of people who depend on coal for their livelihood. We need to stop cutting down the forests, but there are a lot of people who depend on cutting down forests for their livelihood. I don't think this is an insurmountable problem. I believe that what we have is a distribution problem more than a scarcity problem in terms of adequate, meaningful work for all human beings. There's a lot of work to do. If we actually put people to work fixing our schools, fixing our collapsed infrastructure, providing quality health care for everyone, we could provide a lot of good jobs. And we could pay people a living wage. And we could grow our economy, incidentally. It's very interesting, but our economy, you may not have noticed, is in collapse right now. And one of the things they're suggesting is, well, we've got to infuse the economy with some spending. Well, one of the things we could spend it on is human needs. And in that process, create jobs, and those jobs could have living wage. If you give the workers on the bottom of the economic ladder decent wages, they will go out and spend that money, and it will grow our economy. Now, this may sound like old-fashioned Keynesian economics, but it got us out of one depression. And I think it can get us out of this one. So I am not convinced that sustainability and getting off our dependence on fossil fuels will mean we can't have good, decent jobs. Creating alternative energy, there are going to be a lot of good jobs in that. We haven't tried it. But I know that in human history there have been places on this planet where we've sustained huge populations. My home state of Hawaii is one of them, at a sustainable level before the industrial age. Everyone worked and everyone ate, and it happened with 1 million people on a small island. So the way to do it is there. I don't think that fixing the environment means we have to kill jobs. It may mean we have to redistribute, and we can do that in a way that lessens the impact on workers and their lives and their families. See, whenever someone's facing you with a choice like that, think of it as intellectual blackmail. Say, well, wait a minute. What are all the assumptions that went into setting up that choice? We either have clean air or jobs. What 5 premises are you counting on? And how can you disprove my 5 counter premises? Those are the kind of conversations we need to have.
I'm wondering if a person is passionate about social justice and making changes that benefit, the population in a positive way, why choose law as one place to start? So, and more broadly, just what is the place and the potential for law to make these kinds of changes?
Yeah. I'm not suggesting that anyone choose law. But for my students who have chosen law, what I tell them is that law is one of the locations of power. That is, anytime you go out and try to make positive social change, you will run up against law, and particularly law used as a club to do the kind of thing that the previous questioner is hinting that people do to us all the time. Well, you can't do this because of this. Oh, sure, you want to do this, but there's a law that says you can't. And one of the reasons for going to law school is to say, oh, yes, I can. In other words, law is a rhetorical system that you can use. It's a tool. And when you learn how to use the tool, then no one can back you into that corner and say, oh, well, there's a law that says you can't do that, because you know how to fight back with law. Historically, a lot of the evil that's been done in the world, the current state of wealth inequality has been helped along by a taxation system that is funneling money from poor and working people and middle-class people to the very wealthiest. We've got a whole taxation system that encourages forms of amassing capital and not having to contribute anything to the public good. These are all legal structures that have been developed to benefit people in power. And someone has to see that, unmask it, call it what it is, theft, and lawyers are in a position to do that. So it's a tool like any other tool. I don't think it's the only tool, and I don't think it's the most important tool. But for people who happen to have a facility for manipulation of language. It's one way that you can contribute. And I think particularly in the United States, because we're a pluralistic country and so much of the grabbing is masked, law is an ideological system that justifies the way things are. The whole structure of things like private property makes it seem inevitable that the way things are the way it's always going to be. And so law becomes a place where we have to fight that ideological part of the fight. But that's not the biggest part. It's important, but it's not the biggest part.
Hey, you mentioned redistribution as a method of relieving the problem, and I think such a thing has been tried before in form of communism. And how would you argue that the what you're thinking as redistribution wouldn't take the same form as communism and be better than that?
Could you repeat the first part of the question? I missed it.
You said redistribution of wealth will solve the problem we have, and I'm thinking that sounds a lot like communism.
Ah,
Just saying.
okay. Well, first of all, when I talk about redistribution, I'm really talking about redistribution. In other words, we have a structure now that takes from some and advantages others, right? So for instance, I'm guessing that many of you are renters. We have a tax system that disadvantages renters and favors homeowners. That is, the government will pay you basically to buy a house. All right. When I talk about redistribution, I'm saying let's think about, in fairness terms, since it's all distributed, we are making a collective choice how we're going to distribute. In fairness terms, let's talk about a distribution system that's more equitable. So it's interesting to me when we have a system that distributes upward to the wealthiest, like the Bush tax cuts. That's not redistribution, bad, redistribution, bad. But when I say, let's do something to put money in the pockets of poor and working people, that's redistribution, bad, communism. In fact, I think there are some very wealthy people, like Warren Buffett, who would agree with me that wealth inequality is bad for the economy and bad for the health of the nation overall, and that we really need to do something about it. And that's not necessarily communism, although I also would like to say that I resist red baiting. That is, the idea of economic fairness, that we might want to have a system that collectivizes certain aspects of our economy, like education. You know, I think that ought to be a public good, and increasingly it's being privatized. I'm pushing in the opposite direction, that there ought to be some things that ought to be public. Healthcare. If you want to say to me, well, that sounds communist, I won't back down on that, because I don't see it as inconsistent with a healthy democracy to make sure that everyone has the minimum that they need in order to participate in the polity. I don't know if I'm being fair in answering your question. Okay. Yeah, you know, the Cold War is over and McCarthyism is over. And I think we've developed a very bad habit in this country of any time we talk about something that meets human needs, someone will say, well, that's socialism or that's communism, and therefore we can't do it. What if it happens to be the wisest course of public policy, and what if we're all going to benefit from doing it? It doesn't mean that we end our entire system of private ownership of property and capitalism, but it means that we ameliorate its excesses so that, in fact, it can continue. You know, that's what FDR did in the New Deal. And we should open our minds to it as a possibility.
Hi. I guess you kind of alluded to this already, but my question is, and I guess it's probably been your observance as well, that capitalism that money and morals kind of go hand in hand, and like talking about the redistribution of resources. And so my question is, do you think that democracy can truly exist in a capitalist society? I guess that's my question.
I don't think democracy and unrestrained capital can coexist. In other words, when people are allowed to lie, cheat, and steal, to buy legislation, to control politicians with their money that has been concentrated in a few hands, that's not a good thing for democracy. And I don't think that what I'm saying is un-American. That is, I think if I could get the founding fathers in the room, they'd agree. And ultimately, I don't think it's good for capital either. That is, if you listen carefully to the really, people that have way more money than I do and know a lot more about how capital is amassed and how it moves around the world, and who are primarily concerned with preserving their own wealth, global instability is a real threat to them. And they understand that inequality is feeding that instability. And they're with me at least 25% of the way when I say we've got to do something about inequality. Now, where I lose them is when I ask them to make genuine sacrifices of their own wealth and power. But somewhere there's room for a conversation in this country about getting more democracy by restraining the excesses of every person for themselves, winner-take-all kind of economic system, which has never been laissez-faire. That is, it's always been, as I said, there's a whole legal regime, a regulatory regime, a taxation regime, in which the government is aiding certain people in amassing and retaining their wealth and excluding others from doing the same thing. And it's not good for democracy.
Hi, I was wondering, you were just talking about privatization, and and especially I'm thinking in terms of education. You're also talking about like if a person can have an effect on a school individually. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the charter school movement, and especially thinking of how some charter schools may benefit the kids that go to those schools, but some schools in the same district may be left out of taking advantage of those opportunities that one school has. So I was just wondering what you thought about that movement.
Yeah, that goes back to the problem that I talked about in my talk of institutionalized, centralized forms of power versus decentralized, spontaneous, community-based. To the extent that charter schools are reflecting the real needs of particular communities and reflect the self-determination of those communities, I don't want to discourage them. At the same time, I think what we need is massive infusion of help for our schools. Teachers need to be paid more. Classrooms need to be smaller. We've got to bring back art, music, physical education for all students in all schools. And I think your question kind of implies that if we just cherry pick and have a few exquisite, precious schools, what about everybody? You know, the majority of people in this country are still going to go to their neighborhood school, and we want them to be able to get a high-quality public education within walking distance. Why is that so impossible? They've done it in other countries. All right. So my answer to the question on charter schools is it depends. There's some very bad charter schools. There's some excellent charter schools. But I want a level of reform that would improve every school. And we're not going to get that. To get a really good charter school, and Charles Lawrence, my co-author, is on the board of one, takes huge effort. The school I'm referring to is the Maya Angelou School in Washington, D.C. The ratio of adults to kids is almost one-on-one there. They've got psychiatrists, social workers. This is a school that takes kids from the criminal justice system and really works to turn around their lives. And they've had amazing successes. But the level of resources they've had to put into that school, the fundraising is just, it'd be very hard to duplicate. And it works. So I'm not about to shut it down, but it's a model that's going to be very hard to replicate. And I want something that's replicatable, that we could put in every neighborhood. And that's going to have to be a public school model. And we can do it.
First of all, thanks for your talk. It's been really fascinating. I wanted to ask, speaking of amassing wealth, I don't know if anybody's mentioned to you that Dartmouth College has an endowment of $4.5 billion. And we're currently in the midst of a capital campaign, just past the $1 billion mark, headed for a goal of $1.3 billion. So is Dartmouth and are other institutions like Dartmouth part of the problem or part of the solution?
At the risk of being a bad guest, and I'll include the entire academy in my indictment, so that would include my own university and the ones that I've graduated from. Until we make a real commitment to sharing our advantages with the communities around us, I would say we continue to be part of the problem, which is not to knock any of the wonderful things that I know are going on here, to be real community partners. And I just saw in today's New York Times that the president of this university is going to make the university more affordable to its own students and use some of the endowment to do that. And I commend all of those things. But my wish list for our major universities, and particularly the most elite with the biggest endowments, is that they drill downward and really find a way to share the resources of institutions like this one with those kids that are going to schools where they don't even have heat in the winter. Bring them here so that they could see what it looks like to go to university, and start early, and send your students to where they are. They're kids that never get read to. And if you never get read to before you're 5 years old, you will not be a strong reader. The neurons are forming in that period from 1 to 5. These are the things our university could be contributing to, and it could enrich the educational experiences of our own students if we did it in a really massive way. And we're not doing it yet. We're starting, there are little bits and pieces everywhere, and I don't want to criticize the many, many people within the academy who have worked so hard to do this. But I think, given the level of wealth that exists in places like this, we could do more. We could do more to have true economic diversity in our student bodies. We've got some, but not at the level that we could if we were really reaching out. And it would require changing the culture of our institutions. Having a more open door admissions policy. It would be a massive change in the culture of our institutions. But every time someone says, like with the environmental question, well, we can't do that. Here are all these reasons why we can't do it. We'd have to give up so much. Can we afford not to? Can we really afford to live in these beautiful sheltered enclaves where we don't face up to the fact that we're leaving so many of our fellow citizens behind? Because as Langston Hughes says, it explodes. And we can't predict where or when. But this illusion of peace we have in this world is just an illusion, as long as we continue to leave the majority of people on the outside of participation. So we could do more.
Thank you again for speaking today. You responded to a question about how law can be used as an instrument of social change. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to how one can become an instrument of social change through teaching, and more specifically, how a teacher can avoid being so caught up in the emergencies that she or he is unable to address the structure.
Yeah. Well, other people like Freire have talked about how we form a pedagogy that makes real citizen agents, people that know how to take charge of the conditions of their own lives and demand real working democracy. So the formula is out there for doing it. I also think that in meeting our short-term goals, which is the students have got to pass those darn standardized tests, which we criticize all over in our book. But if the goal is just attaining functional literacy, I think we do it better when we teach students to be change agents and to be responsible for their own education from the very beginning, from age 3. This is your world. You own it. That's your water table. What are we going to put in it today? To develop that habit of agency. Oh, why? You think spiders. Will that work? Who thinks it'll work? Let's talk about it. So I think teachers can do it, and teachers are going to be absolutely critical in teaching people what it means to be a citizen. A citizen is a person who thinks for themselves and speaks to their neighbors about what our world ought to look like and stands up when something is wrong. And so many of us have just gotten out of that habit. And I include myself in that indictment. You know, I am a parent with kids in public schools. There's so many things that are falling apart all around. You just get, oh, well, you know, the toilets. There are other things that are more important. We'll let that go this year. And you can't do that. You can't get in that habit of saying, oh, well, good enough. Not when it comes to our kids. And one thing we could do is to teach them to speak up for themselves. If the students can identify what's wrong with their school, and believe me, if you talk to them, they can. Are you a teacher? All right. Yeah, so you know this. Students, the kids can tell you what's unfair, what's wrong with the food in the cafeteria, et cetera. Let's put the question to them. So what can you do about it? Who's your target? Who has the power to make change in this? How can you influence that person? Who knows how to run a press conference? How can we find out how to run a press conference? And in the process of gaining power, incidentally, you also gain literacy at a level that has real meaning. That is the ability to think critically, to manipulate language, to do all the things that get you to a place like Dartmouth. So teachers are a big part of this. And I think we should start by giving them raises so they could really do this work.
Hi, do you listen to Bob Marley's music?
Yes. But I'll have to confess that it's not usually because I put it on. It's usually the other people in my family. And it was a student when I talked about Freire who said to me, Professor, that's from Bob Marley. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. So that's where I got that. What do you listen to? Okay.
Time for one more question.
I was just wondering if you could briefly touch on what you think has been the impact of the policy of No Child Left Behind.
I think No Child Left Behind has been a good galvanizer of communities. Teachers are furious about it. Parents are starting to understand that it's a fraud. We needed schools that work, and you gave us standardized tests. And even some Republican mayors and governors are starting to say to the people who invented this monstrosity without funding it, this is not working. Now, the one thing in No Child Left Behind that I think has been useful and that I wouldn't want to throw out altogether is the notion of accountability. That is, we really ought to be looking at the attainment rates for each individual child and break it down by individual and break it down by poverty level and break it down by race, but not in a way that mandates teaching to the test. And really, it's horrible what this has done to our kids. They're drilling worksheets instead of learning to write and think. So I don't think it's going to be around for long because it's pretty obvious that it's not working. Thank you.